The morning sun painted long shadows across the dusty town square where people slowly gathered for what everyone called a placement day. Children from the overcrowded orphanage stood nervously in a line, waiting to meet families who might take them home. But today felt different, and everyone knew it. 16-year-old Rose stood at the edge of the wooden platform, her thin arms wrapped tightly round baby Grace. The little one was only 3 months old, with soft blonde curls and bright blue eyes that seemed to take in everything round her. Grace made small cooing sounds as she looked up at Rose, completely trusting the girl who had become her whole world. Rose's heart beat so fast she thought everyone could hear it. She looked out at the crowd of strangers gathering below. There were farmers with sun-weathered faces looking for strong hands to help with their crops. Shopkeepers in clean aprons needed extra help in their stores. A few well-dressed families had come hoping to find a child to love and raise as their own. But Rose could see the truth in their eyes. Most people wanted just one thing, not two. "Please don't let them take you away from me," Rose whispered softly to Grace. The baby's tiny fingers grabbed onto Rose's worn dress, as if she understood. "I made you a promise the day you came to us, and I always keep my promises," Rose remembered. That cold winter morning 3 months ago, when she heard crying outside the orphanage door. She had been the first to run outside and find Grace bundled in a small blanket on the doorstep. There was only a tiny piece of paper tucked beside the baby that said, "Please love her." Rose had picked up Grace and held her close, and something magical happened. In that moment, Rose knew she would do anything to protect this little person. She felt like more than a big sister. She felt like Grace's guardian angel sent from heaven. But now everything was changing. The orphanage had more children than it could feed or house properly. Mrs. Thompson, the kind woman who ran the orphanage, had tried everything to raise money, but there simply wasn't enough. With tears in her eyes, she had to make the hardest decision of her life. Some children would have to find new homes. Rose understood why it had to happen, but understanding didn't make her heart hurt any less. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice that carried across the whole square, stepped up onto the platform. He cleared his throat loudly and called out, "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll start the bidding now. Do I hear $10 for this strong young girl? She can work hard and knows how to take care of things. And $5 for the sweet baby, healthy as can be and gentle as a lamb." Rose felt hot tears start to fill her eyes as voices from the crowd began calling out numbers. She could see a stern-looking woman in a black dress pointing at Grace and talking to her husband. The woman had kind eyes, but Rose could tell she only wanted the baby. Near the front, a farmer with hands rough from years of hard work was nodding at Rose, clearly thinking about the help she could provide on his land. But he kept shaking his head when the auctioneer mentioned Grace, each new voice calling out. Bids felt like a sharp knife cutting into Rose's heart. These weren't bad people. She could see that most of them genuinely wanted to provide good homes. But they all wanted to split up the only family Rose had ever really known. "Please," Rose called out, though her voice came out small and shaky. "We need to stay together. Grace needs me, and I need her." The auctioneer looked up at her with eyes that weren't unkind, but he shook his head firmly. "That's not how this works, young lady. People bid for what they can afford and what they need. Most folks can't take on both a worker and a baby." The bidding continued, and Rose could feel the numbers getting higher. The moment when she would have to hand Grace over to a stranger was getting closer and closer. She held the baby tighter against her chest, feeling Grace's small heart beat against her own. Grace seemed to sense something was wrong and started Making small worried sounds, Rose closed her eyes tightly and sent up a desperate prayer to whoever might be listening in heaven. Please, if there's any kindness left in this whole world, please don't let them take her away from me. I'll work harder than anyone. I'll do anything. Just please let us stay together. The voices round her seemed to get louder and more excited as the bidding continued. Rose felt like she was in a terrible dream where everything she loved was about to disappear. She opened her eyes and looked down at Grace, memorizing every detail of the baby's face, just in case this was the last moment they would have together. Grace looked back up at her with complete trust, not knowing that their whole world was about to change forever. At the very back of the growing crowd stood a man who looked different from all the others. Thomas Bennett was 42 years old, tall and strong from years of hard work on his cattle ranch. His gentle blue eyes watched everything happening on the platform, and his weathered hands hung quietly at his sides. He had not come to town planning to be part of this day at all. Thomas had ridden into town that morning just to buy supplies for his ranch, some flour, coffee, and a few tools he needed to fix his broken fence. But as he tied his horse outside the general store, he heard voices gathering in the town square, curious about what was happening. He had walked over to see what all the noise was about for the past years. Thomas had lived completely alone on his ranch outside of town. His beloved wife Mary and their baby son William had both died from a terrible fever that swept through the area. Since that awful day, Thomas felt like his whole world had turned gray and empty. He still worked hard every single day, taking care of his cattle and keeping his ranch running. But he worked from when the sun came up until it went down just to keep his mind busy. When night came and he sat in his quiet house, the silence felt so heavy it was hard to breathe. Thomas had loved Mary more than life itself. She had been his best friend, his partner in everything, and the light that made every day worth living. Their son William had been just 6 months old when the fever took him. But in those short months, Thomas had discovered a love deeper than he ever knew was possible, after losing them both. Thomas thought his heart had died to Dot, but now, as he watched Rose hold baby Grace with such fierce protection and love, something deep inside his chest began to stir. It was a feeling he had not experienced since the day he buried his family. He watched the way Rose whispered gently to the baby, the way she held Grace close against her heart, the way she looked ready to fight the whole world to keep the little one safe. It reminded him so much of how Mary had held their son William, with that same complete and unshakable love. The bidding was getting louder and more intense. Thomas could see the fear growing in Rose's eyes as different people called out amounts for either her or the baby, but never for both together. He watched as tears started to roll down the young girl's cheeks, and he felt an anger building inside him at the unfairness of it all. Without really thinking about what he was doing, Thomas heard his own voice call out loudly across the square, $25 for both of them together. Every single person in the crowd turned round to look at him in complete surprise. Thomas had not planned to say anything at all, but seeing Rose's desperate face had made something snap inside him. The auctioneer looked confused and blinked several times before responding. "Sir, I'm sorry, but they're being bid on separately. That's how we do things here." Thomas felt his jaw set firmly as he stepped forward through the crowd. His boots made loud sounds on the wooden planks as he walked closer to the platform. $25 for both, or I turn round and walk away right now," he said in a voice that let everyone know he meant exactly what he said. "The girl is absolutely right. They belong together, and anyone with eyes can see that." Rose looked down at this tall stranger with complete amazement. She could see that he was strong and serious, But there was something in his blue eyes that made her think he understood what it felt like to lose people you loved. There was a sadness there that matched the sadness she carried in her own heart when nobody else in the crowd spoke up or made another bid. Thomas called out even louder, $30 for both. The auctioneer looked all round the square, waiting to see if anyone else wanted to bid that much money for 2 children together. But the crowd stayed completely quiet. Most people had come looking for either a worker or a child to raise, not both at the same time. $30 was more money than most of them had planned to spend. Finally, the auctioneer raised his small hammer high in the air, so to the gentleman in the back he called out, bringing the hammer down with a loud bang that echoed across the whole square. Rose felt like her legs might give out from pure relief. She and Grace were going to stay together. They had been saved by this kind stranger who understood that they were meant to be a family. Thomas walked up the steps to the platform and gently reached out his hand to help Rose step down safely. Why? She held Grace. "My name is Thomas Bennett," he said in a quiet, gentle voice. "I have a cattle ranch just outside of town. You will both work for your keep and help run the place, but you will be safe there. And the baby stays with you always. That is my promise to you." Rose looked into his eyes and saw something she had not seen in such a long time. Real, honest kindness from someone who expected nothing in return. "Thank you so much, Mr. Bennett," she whispered, her voice full of gratitude. "Thank you for keeping us together." As they walked toward his wagon to begin their new life, baby Grace reached up with her tiny hand and grabbed hold of Thomas's big finger, for the first time in 2 whole years. Thomas felt his face break into a real, genuine smile. The wagon ride to Thomas Bennett's ranch took almost 2 hours, winding through dusty roads that led away from the busy town and into the peaceful countryside. Rose sat quietly beside Thomas on the wagon seat, holding Grace close and watching. The world changed around them. She had never been so far from town before, and everything looked different and new. When they finally arrived at the ranch, Rose could hardly believe her eyes. The Bennett ranch spread out before them like something from a dream. There was a sturdy wooden house painted white with a wide front porch that wrapped round the sides. A big red barn stood nearby, and beyond that were fields of green grass that seemed to go on forever until they met the purple mountains in the distance. Rose had spent her whole life surrounded by buildings and busy streets, so she had never seen so much open space or breathed air that smelled so clean and fresh. "It's beautiful," Rose whispered, bouncing Grace gently as the baby looked round with wide, curious eyes. Thomas helped them down from the wagon and carried their few belongings toward the house. Everything they owned fit into one small cloth bag. But Rose did not feel embarrassed about that. She felt grateful to have anything at all. Inside the house, Thomas led them down a short hallway to a small bedroom near the back. The room had pale yellow walls and a window that looked out over the vegetable garden. In one corner sat a wooden rocking chair with soft cushions, and Rose could picture a mother sitting there, holding her baby and singing quiet songs. "This was my wife's room," Thomas said quietly, his voice becoming softer than usual. Rose could tell it was difficult for him to talk about his wife, and she noticed how his eyes looked sad when he mentioned her. She would have wanted it to be used for a baby again. Rose understood that this room held special memories for Thomas, and she felt honored that he was sharing it with them. "We will take very good care of it," she said simply, not wanting to say too much when she could see the pain in his eyes in those first few weeks at the ranch. Everything felt strange and new for all of them. Rose was not sure exactly what Thomas expected her to do each day, and she worried about making mistakes that might make him sorry he had brought them home. Thomas had been living alone for so long that he had almost forgotten how to talk to children. And sometimes he would start to say something and then stop, looking unsure of himself. But little Grace seemed to help bring them together without even trying. When she giggled at the chickens pecking round the yard, both Rose and Thomas could not help but smile. When she reached for Thomas with her tiny hands, his whole face would light up with joy. Grace was like a bridge between them, helping them feel more comfortable with each other. Every morning, Rose would wake up before the sun and help Thomas prepare breakfast. She learned to crack eggs without getting shells in the pan and to slice bread evenly. Then they would go outside to do the morning chores together. Thomas taught her how to milk the gentle cows, showing her the right way to sit on the little stool and how to squeeze just right to make the milk flow into the bucket. He showed her where the chickens laid their eggs and how to gather them without frightening the birds. Rose had never done farm work before, so she made many mistakes at first. Sometimes she would spill the milk or drop the eggs, and she would feel terrible about wasting food. But Thomas was always patient with her, showing her again and again until she got it right, and never making her feel stupid or clumsy. "You are learning very quickly," he told her one afternoon when she successfully fixed a broken fence post all by herself. "My wife Mary always used to say that hard work builds strong character in a person." In the evenings, after all the work was finished, they would sit together on the wide front porch. Grace would crawl around on a blanket, playing with a wooden horse that Thomas had carved for her with his own hands. Sometimes Thomas would tell Rose stories about the ranch and the animals, or about the time a family of deer came right up to the house looking for food. Sometimes Rose would sing the lullabies she remembered from the orphanage, her voice soft and sweet in the quiet evening air. These peaceful moments felt like what Rose had always imagined a real family might be like. Daughters there. Weeks turned into months. Rose began to notice changes in all of them. The deep sadness that had lived in Thomas's eyes started to fade little by little. He laughed out loud when Grace took her first wobbly steps across the kitchen floor, and he clapped with pride when Rose learned to ride Buttercup, his gentlest horse. Rose felt something growing inside her that she had never really known before. The warm feeling of being truly wanted and cared for by people who chose to love her. One night, Grace came down with a high fever that made her cry and refuse to eat. Rose and Thomas took turns all night long, cooling her forehead with damp cloths and singing softly to comfort her. When morning came and Grace's fever finally broke, they looked at each other and smiled with relief. In that moment, Rose realized something wonderful and amazing. They had become a real family. 2 wonderful years had passed at the Bennett Ranch like pages from the most beautiful dream anyone could imagine. Rose had grown from a frightened 16-year-old girl into a confident young woman of 18, who knew how to run a household and work alongside Thomas in every aspect of ranch life. Little Grace had blossomed into a happy, chattering 2-year-old with bright golden curls who ran round the ranch like she owned every inch of it. She called Thomas Papa in her sweet little voice, and when she said it, his whole face would light up with pure joy. The ranch had truly become a home filled with warmth, laughter, and the kind of love that makes ordinary moments feel magical. Every morning brought the sound of Grace's giggles as she helped Rose collect eggs from the chicken coop. Every evening ended with the 3 of them sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange while Grace played at their feet with the wooden toys Thomas carved for each. During the long winter evenings, then one crisp autumn morning, when the leaves on the trees round the ranch were turning gold and red, everything changed in an instant. Rose was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sound of wheels on the dirt road leading to their home. But this was not the familiar sound of Thomas's wagon or a neighbor's simple cart. This was something much fancier. The sound of a well-made carriage with brass fittings and perfectly balanced wheels. Rose walked round to the front of the house, wiping her hands on her apron, and felt her heart begin to beat faster when she saw what was approaching. A beautiful black carriage with shiny paint and elegant curtains was pulling up to their front porch, drawn by two perfectly groomed horses. This was the kind of carriage that belonged to wealthy city people, not the simple country folk who usually visited their ranch. A woman stepped down from the carriage first, and Rose felt the blood drain from her face when she got a good look at her. The woman was about 25 years old and dressed in the finest clothes Rose had ever seen. A deep blue dress made of silk with tiny pearl buttons, and a matching hat with real feathers. But what made Rose's heart drop into her stomach was the woman's appearance. She had the exact same golden blonde hair as Grace, styled in fashionable curls, and the exact same bright green eyes that sparkled when the sunlight hit them. A man followed the woman out of the carriage, and he was dressed just as expensively in a fine black suit with a gold watch chain hanging from his vest pocket. He looked like the kind of man who owned businesses in the city and had never worked with his hands a day in his life. Thomas came out of the barn where he had been working, and Rose could see the confusion and concern on his face as he looked at these unexpected visitors. Grace was playing in the dirt near the porch with her favorite wooden doll, completely unaware that anything unusual was happening. "Good morning," the woman said, and Rose could hear that her voice was shaking with nervousness. "My name is Catherine Mills, and this is my husband, Robert. I hope you will forgive us for arriving without warning, but I believe you have my daughter." Thomas immediately stepped protectively in front of Rose and Grace, his strong frame blocking them from the strangers. His voice was firm and cautious when he responded. "I am not sure what you mean by that, ma'am. Perhaps you have made some kind of mistake." Catherine reached into her small purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, her hands trembling as she held it out toward Thomas. "2 years ago, I left my baby at the orphanage in town. I was very young and unmarried, and I thought I was giving her the best chance at a good life. But now I am married to a good man, and we can provide for her properly. I want my daughter back." Rose felt like the world was spinning round her as she knelt down and pulled Grace close. The little girl could sense the tension in the air, even though she did not understand what was happening, and she pressed herself against Rose's familiar warmth. Rose could feel her own hands shaking as she held Grace tight. "Grace is happy here," Rose said, fighting to keep her voice steady and strong. "This is her home. She does not even know who you are." Catherine's eyes filled with tears that began to spill down her cheeks, making tracks through the powder on her face. "But I am her real mother," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I never stopped loving her, not for one single day. I just thought I was doing the right thing by giving her up. I thought someone else could give her a better life than I could." The next day, Judge Wilson came out to the ranch to examine Catherine's papers and hear everyone's side of the story. He was known throughout the county as a fair and honest man, but Rose could see in his eyes that the law was very clear about situations like this. Catherine had official documents proving she was Grace's birth mother, and she was now married to a man who could provide a good home. "I am truly sorry," Judge Wilson said to Thomas and Rose, his voice heavy with regret. "Mrs. Mills has proven beyond any doubt that she is the child's birth mother, and she can clearly provide a stable home. According to the law, the child must be returned to her." That night, Rose sat in Grace's little room packing the child's few belongings into a small bag. Her tears fell on the pretty dresses Thomas had bought for Grace and on the wooden toys he had carved with such love and care. Grace sat on the bed watching, not understanding why Mama Rose was crying or why all her things were being put away. "Mama Rose stay with Grace?" the little girl asked in her sweet voice, using the name she had given Rose when she first learned to talk. Rose pulled Grace into her arms and held her as tight as she dared, breathing in the sweet smell of her hair and trying to memorize the feel of the small body she had cared for since Grace was just 3 months old. "I do not know what will happen, my sweet baby," Rose whispered through her tears, "but no matter what, you must always remember that Papa Thomas and Mama Rose love you more than all the stars in the sky." The next morning came too quickly, bringing with it the moment that Rose had been dreading since Judge Wilson had made his decision. Catherine Mills arrived at the ranch in her fancy carriage, dressed in another beautiful outfit and carrying a small traveling bag for Grace. Her husband, Robert, stayed in the carriage, giving the women space to handle this difficult situation. Rose had spent the entire night holding Grace close, singing every lullaby she knew and whispering stories about all the wonderful adventures they had shared on the ranch. Grace had fallen asleep in Rose's arms, completely unaware that this might be their last night together as a family. Catherine walked slowly up the porch steps, her face showing a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She had probably spent weeks imagining this moment, the joyful reunion where her daughter would run into her arms and they would finally be the family she had always dreamed of having. But as she reached out her hands toward Grace, something completely different happened. Grace took one look at this strange woman and immediately clung to Rose with all the strength in her small body. Her tiny arms wrapped round Rose's neck so tightly that Rose could barely breathe, and Grace began to cry in a way that broke everyone's heart. "Mama Rose, Papa," Grace sobbed, her voice filled with fear and confusion. She kept repeating the names over and over, as if saying them loudly enough would make this scary situation go away. Catherine's face completely crumpled as she watched her daughter's reaction. All of her dreams about this moment disappeared in an instant. She had imagined Grace being happy to meet her real mother, maybe even excited to go on an adventure to a new home. Instead, her own child was terrified of her and clinging desperately to the people Grace truly saw as her parents. Thomas, who had been standing quietly near the door, stepped forward with his usual calm manner. "Mrs. Mills," he said gently, "perhaps we could sit down and talk for a few minutes before we do anything else." They sat together on the wide porch while Rose took Grace inside the house to try to calm her down. Through the window, Catherine could see Rose rocking Grace in the old wooden chair, singing in a soft voice that gradually made Grace's sobs turn into quiet sniffles. Thomas spoke quietly but with complete honesty about the past 2 years of their life together. He told Catherine about the morning when Grace had taken her very first wobbly steps across their kitchen floor, reaching for Rose with arms stretched wide. He described how Grace loved to help feed the chickens every morning, giggling when they packed grain from her tiny hands. He talked about their evening routine, how Grace would curl up between him and Rose on the big sofa for bedtime stories, her head resting on Rose's shoulder while Thomas read from a book of fairy tales. "She is not just loved here," Thomas said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is truly her home, and we are truly her family." And Rose has been more of a mother to that child than anyone could possibly ask for. She gave up her own childhood to take care of Grace from the very beginning. Catherine listened to every word, and as she did, she watched through the window as Rose continued to comfort Grace. She could see something that could not be faked or forced, the deep, unbreakable bond between Rose and Grace that had grown over 2 years of daily love and care. This was not just someone taking care of a child because they had to. This was a mother loving her daughter with every piece of her heart. "I thought I was doing what was best for Grace," Catherine whispered, fresh tears starting to flow down her cheeks. But I think I was really being selfish. I wanted to make myself feel better about giving her up more than I wanted what was truly best for her. Robert, who had been listening quietly from nearby, came over and put his hand gently on his wife's shoulder. "Catherine," he said softly, "you gave that child the gift of life. But these good people gave her love and a real family. Maybe there's a way for everyone to win in this situation." That afternoon, Catherine Mills made what was probably the hardest and most truly loving decision of her entire life. She asked Judge Wilson to come back to the ranch so she could officially request that Thomas be allowed to legally adopt both Rose and Grace as his daughters. "I would like to visit sometimes, if that would be all right with everyone," she told Rose, her voice humble and sincere. "Not as Grace's mother. You have earned that title completely. But maybe as a family friend who loves her and wants to be part of her life." Rose wiped away her own tears and nodded with understanding. "Grace should know where she came from," Rose said kindly. "And she should know that her birth mother loved her enough to make sure she ended up where she would be truly happy." 6 months later, on a beautiful spring morning, they all gathered at the courthouse in town. Thomas officially adopted both Rose and Grace as his legal daughters. Rose chose to take the Bennett name, becoming Rose Bennett, and little Grace became Grace Bennett as well. As they walked out of the courthouse into the warm sunshine, Grace walked between Thomas and Rose, holding both of their hands tightly, and they looked exactly like what they had always been in their hearts, a real family. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching another gorgeous sunset, Thomas worked on carving a new wooden sign for their front gate. The sign read, "The Bennett Family Ranch, where love lives in careful, neat letters." Rose smiled as she watched Grace chase fireflies round the yard, her laughter floating on the evening breeze. She thought about the incredible journey that had brought them from that terrifying day at the auction to this perfect moment of complete belonging. "Thank you," she said quietly to Thomas. "For what?" he asked, looking up from his carving. "For seeing that Grace and I belonged together. For choosing love instead of loneliness." Thomas smiled and gently ruffled Grace's hair as she ran up to them carrying a handful of wild flowers she had picked. "Thank you both for teaching this old heart how to love again," he said. "You saved me just as much as I saved you."